Teşekkür to everyone. I would like to thank the organization Hazar and its leadership for inviting me. As my special thanks to Prof. Ravza, who was playing a very important role in connecting me with the organization. So thank you very much, Prof. Ravza, for making this possible. I hope we will continue to work together in the future. And Dr. Emel, Professor Emel, also thank you very much for moderating this session. Yes, I'm going to share my screen now, but before I do that, perhaps a little bit about me, who I am, how did I come to being what I am right now? So I originally come from Bosnia, but have been living in Australia now for more than 20 years. My PhD was on, I looked at manhaj of the Salafis and the progressives, and how come they interpret the Quran and the Sunnah in very different ways, and how these differences in interpretational methodology, how they manifest themselves when we think about what does it mean to be an ideal Muslim woman in Islam, and by extension also what it means to be an ideal Muslim man, especially in the context of marriage. Yeah. So and I have been writing on the topic pertaining to gender issues probably since 2007. Yes. And I always had a strong interest in the interpretational methodology aspect of this question. And this will be reflected in my presentation today. Pardon me. I apologize if my slides are a little bit too theoretical, but I will try and explain them in an easier way, easier language. And it's not so easy online, especially if we were together in a lecture theater, it would be easier. But because we are meeting online and there's technical difficulties, that makes it even harder to convey the message and what I want to say. So, and I only have 20 minutes. So, if there is one thing that I want to tell you and inform you is, and most of us are aware of this, the question of Islam and gender equality, or Islam and democracy, or Islam, whatever topic we decide to talk about, really, we need to do a lot of deconstruction. We need to do a lot of we need to look at the concepts very carefully and really come to the realization that many differences that we have about the relationship between Islam and gender equality are because we have different understandings of what Islam is and what gender equality means as well. These are abstract concepts, yeah? And if I would like to bring to our attention this idea of the importance of interpretation, interpretational awareness, and methodology, trying to kind of deconstruct why is it that we have different approaches, and I'll try to present a case in relation to this question, what kind of Islam or what kind of approach to Islam is necessary in order to make Islam compatible with gender equality the way we think about it in the contemporary human rights era context. Yeah. So how we answer this question, is Islam compatible with gender equality or feminism or whatever word or concept we want to use, will depend upon how we approach the Islamic intellectual tradition, and obviously, how do we conceptualize, how do we think about this idea of gender equality? What specifically does it actually mean? Yeah. And so the case I will be presenting is based upon my understanding of and my approach of what is meant by Islam. Yeah. And some people have a different understanding of the Islamic intellectual tradition, its boundaries, its main delineating features. And because they have different approach, they might answer this question differently. So I'm not saying that my approach is better or the best, but I would like to just explain where do my ideas come from and why do I believe that that it is possible to argue that Islam, the way I am approaching it, or people who share my assumptions, people who share my interpretation methodology, then we can rightly argue that Islam is compatible with gender equality in the sense that is, when I talk about gender equality, I mean in the contemporary human rights era kind of context. Yeah, not the approach to gender equality that we have, let's say, in the classical Islamic tradition, that is premised upon a different concept of the divine, a different understanding of masculinity, femininity, different legal theory, different theology, different legal different legal theory. So all of these fields of study become relevant and pertinent if we want to really deeply engage with this topic. But so today I'm going to just present some of the main delineating features or main elements of my approach, and how it and why, where does it come from, and why does it allow me to interpret and kind of affirm gender equality from within the Islamic perspective. So when I talk about the Islam, all of us know, and Islamic history is obviously testifies to this. We have always had different ideas, different approaches, different conceptualizations, different understandings and embodiments of Islam. Yeah. So by having said that, I think that's important to say that there has always been a variety of approaches and interpretations of Islam. And it took, let's say, 3 to 4 centuries at least for what we consider to be today Islamic orthodoxy for it to form. And it was a result of certain concrete political, I would say primarily political, and to a lesser extent, manhaj-based commitments, assumptions, and approaches. Yeah. So I think one of the central points that I would like to make is that, like any tradition, like any intellectual corpus of knowledge, what we think Islam is really, it's a question of epistemology at one level, but also a question of hermeneutics. So it is possible to construct and interpret a variety of different forms of Islam, and we have always had that. Yeah. So my approach, as you can see, is based upon a number of commitments. Let's call them commitments, yeah, or orientations or assumptions, even at a level of metaphysics. Something that I'm a proponent of, something called process relational metaphysics. Now, it's to explain this, it will take me quite a lot of time. I've already used maybe 10 minutes of my time, and I haven't gone past the first slide. So when I interpret Islam, basically, I interpret it from this vantage point, and I have an entire book that I published in 2017 called The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, yeah, in which I go in a lot of detail as to what this actually means. Yeah, so there's an entire book of 200 pages that explains these elements and what they mean. Yeah, and so obviously I will not have time here, but some of the things that perhaps I would like to emphasize is this idea that there is an emphasis, or we put a lot of importance on not creating boundaries of knowledge. So we take seriously the classical paradigms, yeah, but we are also open. This approach is also open to external sources of knowledge that have not been part of the historical trajectory of Islamic intellectual tradition in a more narrow sense of the term. Yeah, so welcoming new sources of understanding, using new methods or contemporary, if you like, or post-enlightenment tools, literary, hermeneutical. So being open and being having that epistemological openness, and also making use of classical Islamic sciences, usul al-fiqh, ulum al-hadith, all of that, but then also understanding its limits and applying contemporary methods also. Yeah. So that's as much as I'm going to say, and maybe later Dr. Emel might ask me more questions about process. So process relational theology, for example, has a different understanding of the nature of the divine. It is not based on classical theism. Classical theism that we find also in Judaism and Christianity, that, let's say, believes that God knows, is all-knowing in the sense of knowing the particularities of the things that are going to happen in the future as well, even though they haven't happened yet, that God is kind of utterly transcendent, an unmoved mover. So this is all kind of Greek metaphysics that has also been inserted into Islamic theology. So process relational theology has a different understanding of the nature of the divine. And I guess the easiest way for me to explain this, it is much more close to some forms of tasawwuf, especially Ibn al-Arabi's concept of the divine, okay? Where there is emphasis on the immanence of God and the idea that human beings are co-creators with God, and that the divine responds. There is this intimate relationship between the divine and the human. So yeah, it's an entirely kind of different metaphysic.
May I reflect my understanding of process? I think this is a new way of approaching the religion. A process means something is still developing, and it will develop in future as well. And when it is related to the theology, process, that the kind of reflection of the God in each human beings, and in every moment there are new creation. And this creation is by God, and also human beings are also created. Is that so what you mean?
Exactly right. So Allama Muhammad Iqbal, for example, had that kind of understanding of the divine and the human agency as co-creators. So this has implications when we talk about gender issues. I mean, they might not be evident right now, and that perhaps I might not make this an emphasis. Maybe we should focus more on hermeneutics. Yeah, but it's important that behind the hermeneutics, there's also an additional layer that about the nature of reality, nature of the divine, the relationship between the divine and the human, that is kind of in the background. Yeah. That I will not have time to discuss in much detail, because I've already talked about, I've already spent 10 minutes. So basically, my approach to how I conceptualize gender equality and feminism is similar in many ways with Professor Ziba Mir Husseini and Prof. Sadia Sheikh's approach. If you're familiar with the approach of Ziba Mir Husseini and Sadia Sheikh, I share the same kind of commitments and understanding. Yeah. So when I talk about gender equality in Islam from a legalist perspective, for example, yeah, this is a quote from my book, Imperatives of Progressive Islam. It's this idea that it is the context that determines, really, that is the main factor, that is the driving factor behind when we look at the rights and responsibilities, for example, of husbands and wives in the context of marriage. Yeah, in classical Islam, they are very differentiated. They are clearly differentiated and quite hierarchical. Yeah, they are based on the Aristotelian kind of concept of justice that is, very hierarchical and very, let's say, essentialist. Yeah. Whereas our approach, or my approach, says that the texts themselves were product of context. Yeah. And therefore, it is the context that determines what is just and fair in a particular context. We have certain principles, of course, but these principles must always be filtered through a particular contextualist reality. Yeah. So we need to be attentive to the power distributions, also social, economic, political. So it is this really kind of, let's say, there's a postmodernist kind of strong postmodernist element in all of this, where we are kind of hermeneutics of suspicion. Who has the power? Who's Islam? Whose definition are we using? Very sensitive to these kinds of questions, and emphasizing the importance of context and interpreting the principles through that contextualist lens, and not adhering to the kind of essentialist notions of masculinity and femininity, this very hierarchical metaphysics where God is on top, then men are, intellectual men like the philosophers and the fuqaha are second, and then women, and then, slaves and children. So, the classical Islamic interpretation and hermeneutics in relation to gender issues is very kind of Aristotelian, hierarchical, essentialist. Yeah. So that is the rejected in favor of a very kind of contextualist approach. Yeah. I'm going to skip this. So at the level of hermeneutics, what are some of the key features that I think would allow the Islamic interpretative tradition to affirm gender equality in the contemporary sense of the term? Yeah. So I'm here going to mention some of these elements. Yeah. So the first one, this is in relation to the Quran and the Sunnah. Yeah. But also even to the Turath, to the cumulative tradition. Yeah. Like looking at tafsir, for example. So one important element, I think, that can help us develop a contemporary gender-just interpretation of Islam is if we are sensitive to this idea that in the texts, the very approach to reading texts in itself is a process of interpretation. Yeah. All reality is interpretative in nature. And this is also the process relational approach believes that all reality, the whole approach to reality and understanding of reality is perspectival, or it is interpretative. So you're probably familiar with Gadamer and Heidegger and that kind of approach, where reality is seen as, as an act of reading is in itself an act of interpretation. Yeah. And therefore, the kind of subjectivities that the interpreter brings to the reading of the text can often impact the derivation of meaning, the kind of meaning he or she ends up deriving from the text. Yeah. So interpreters or readers, to a large extent, help create the meaning, not just kind of objectively discover meaning from the text itself or from the intention of the author. They co-create the meaning. Yeah, this explains, for example, why a lot of Islamic, let's say, Quranic tafsir or Islamic jurisprudence, why it had a strong patriarchal element to it. The patriarchal bias came through the commitments, or through the subjectivities at the level of the interpreter, then at the level of what I call the communities of interpretation, which is basically the madhab-based hermeneutics, yeah, which is essentially a community of interpreters who have formed around the taqlidi method, yeah, which is the madhab taqlidi method. There are certain methodological manhaj-based commitments that they consider to be normative, okay? So if you consider these manhaj-based commitments to be normative, then that limits your the spectrum of interpretations that you can produce, yeah? So there is subjectivities at the level of the interpreter, individual interpreter, at the level of the madhab, then at the level of the broader society. And we know most of the societies, when the Islamic tradition was being formed, Islamic orthodoxy, they were very patriarchal in nature. So social and cultural mores and norms often influence the kind of interpretational interpretations that the scholars came up with. Yeah, so they had specific ideas about masculinity, for example, masculinity and male authority. Yeah, they believed that only men could exercise public authority, as well as interpretative authority, as well as within the context of family relations. They believe that's because they believe that men are inherently, and this is where this Aristotelian kind of ethics and logic comes into play, that, you know, men are inherently more rational, you know, that only men have had religious kind of experiences that at the level of prophethood. Some use the Quranic verse of Ar-Rijalu Qawamun, you know, to justify this kind of thinking. So there are certain concepts pertaining to the nature of masculinity and femininity that have further reinforced the patriarchal biases in interpretations. Women were seen and associated not with the intellect, but with the private sphere, with family matters, sexuality, and so on. Yeah, so they were more or less excluded from the construction of Islamic knowledge. Yeah, so there are all these levels at the individual, at the level of communities of interpretation, at the level of society, and at the level of symbolism, in a sense, cultural symbolism pertaining to the nature of masculinity and femininity. And all of these have kind of reinforced or helped reinforce patriarchal interpretations of Islam. Yeah, so that's very, very important for us to keep in mind. Yeah, so there are textual interpretation methodology related principles, but also metatextual beliefs, certain beliefs about what does it mean to be a man or what does it mean to be a woman. These beliefs that also have impacted on the kind of interpretations that have been produced. Yeah, as you can see here, the next one has to do with this idea. We know, for example, the Quranic tafsir was primarily done in a fashion of you start with Surah Al-Fatiha 1.1, and then you go next. So we call this a kind of a linear atomistic approach. Professor Fazlur Rahman called this a atomistic linear approach. Whereas this approach says we need to understand, apart from contextualizing the Quran, we need to understand it as a totality, as a coherent whole. and to understand and deduce certain themes, certain reoccurring motives. And only once we have done that, once we have synthesized everything and put it and like using istiqra, using corroborative induction, we need to understand what are the major principles, yeah. And then we interpret the specific in relation to the overarching principle, not other way around. Whereas classical Quranic exegesis in particular, for example, when it was constructing Muslim family laws, it emphasized a couple of Quranic verses like 4.34 and 2.228, but then disregarded certain more gender egalitarian verses in the Quran, yeah, because it didn't really have a holistic thematic approach to the Quran in this context. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, comprehensive contextualization, which means that the text of the Quran itself, this is in the tradition of Amin al-Huli, the Egyptian literary approach to the Quran, like Nasir Abu Zaid and Bintul Shati, that kind of the Quran, putting aside the issue of Quran's ontology, for purposes of interpretation, Quran is seen as a literary and socio-culturally produced text, yeah, and therefore it is important to really, when developing a hermeneutic or interpretation of Quran, it is essential that we understand and approach the Quran through that literary contextualist lens. And if we do that, one of the things we would discover is that the Quran, when it comes to gender issues, at times it challenges some of them, but often it tries to mitigate, it tries to improve things, but it doesn't have this systematic plan worked out. Yeah, it is not. Quran is not, a systematic. Doesn't have a systematic philosophical narrative in it. The Quran is primarily an oral discourse, and if we could use the Christian kind of theological term, charismatic, it's a preach-like text. Yeah. It's a text whose nature is dialectical, discursive, preach-like, and oral. And therefore, to do justice to this kind of communication, it needs to be approached as a dialogical, discursive, oral discourse. It's a discourse, yeah, which requires.
May I add something here? Yeah. To clarify it, actually, this asset of Quran also gives floor to us to develop our understanding from Quran. Since it doesn't give us a certain methodology, we can develop our own methodology and our own knowledge production. Can we say something like this?
Definitely. I mean, if we look, we could make it even more like nature of language itself. Every word can have an inexhaustive number of meanings as well, and meanings are analogical. There's something called indeterminacy of meaning. Professor Khalid Abul-Fadl has talked about this important aspect. He distinguishes between authoritative hermeneutics and authoritarian hermeneutics. Authoritative hermeneutics recognize that at the deepest level of reality, there is something called indeterminacy. We can never really exhaust all the different meanings. Okay, so that's kind of a blessing in a sense. Sometimes it's a curse in the context of legal discourses. You have to come up with the law, yeah. But it's also a blessing in a sense that it allows us to rediscover or discover ever new meanings, yeah, in the Quran, yeah, because of the very nature of language, yeah, and language cannot capture the totality of reality, and there are all these subjectivities at so many different levels. which and in other words, Professor Asma Ballas talks about the polysemous, meaning many meanings, and that classical Islamic tradition, unfortunately, and kind of understandably even, because of their context, because of their commitments, emphasized the kind of a patriarchal aspects of the Quran. I must say, I believe that the Quran often speaks in a patriarchal tone, but also at times also it speaks in an egalitarian tone, and it is up to us as the reader to decide what is, depending upon our concept of the divine, that at the level of aesthetics, even at the level of akhlaq, if you like, at the level of aesthetics, which interpretation suits us more and is more reflective of how we conceptualize the divine. You see, because the text, at the end of the day, texts are very limited and they speak through people. And even if we assumed the kind of, even if we accepted, sorry, I'm taking too much time. Even if we accepted the classical paradigm and the idea that the hadith are the best exegetical tool to interpret the Quran, and if we accept all of this, at the end of the day, it's all about texts, yeah, and transmission of text, and there is so many inherent subjectivities and difficulties that we have to account for and take into account, and which basically the end result is that every interpreter has the right and the responsibility, and this is very important, the responsibility to engage with the text in a responsible, systematic manner, but to recognize at the end of the day that often our inherent values will inevitably shape the process of interpretation. And we know even in Sufism, for example, like when they the concept of dhawq and the idea of our innate ethical compass, that is going to, at the end of the day, have a huge impact on how we go about interpreting texts. Yeah. So this the kind of ethical dimension. Now there is many other. I'm worried that I've already overstepped my time. We all know that the classical paradigm has this idea that the closer we are to the community, the early Muslim community, and the kind of methodologies or the ideas that they have had, that they are more authentic in that sense. Yeah. I think it is very important for us to depart from that kind of frame of mind, because it locks us into a heavily textualist hermeneutic that doesn't allow us to escape the boundaries of classical Islamic epistemology, theology, and hermeneutics. And this is where process relation of theology is very important, because it says that even God is in the divine has is able to evolve towards ever better kind of manifestations of the divine. Yeah. So it allows us to be more forward in our outlook, to say that because the reality is dynamic, because reality is infinitely complex, we have to be open to these changes and the creativity and the novelty and the dynamic nature of the universe. And God is part of kind of the womb of the universe. God is the womb of the universe. So what happens inside the womb also happens to God. So God is not this kind of completely removed entity that is outside of the universe, and then kind of exists completely out of time and space, and kind of manipulates the humanity and the universe like pieces of chess. Yeah, no, God is intimately related and part of the universal matrix. So God is also in the process of change, if you like. So God, one of the God's dimensions in process theology, God has two poles or two aspects: a primordial element that is transcendent and not changing, but also a consequential element that is subject to change. And that is the part that communicates with the human with the creation. Yeah. Otherwise, for example, the prayer wouldn't make any sense if God was completely divorced from creation. Then, you know, if there was no real relationship, tangible relationship between the divine and the creation, then our prayers would not make much sense. So there is all this kind of. So that's why it's important to have an open-ended epistemology, yeah, open-ended epistemology, and not a classical Islamic epistemology that always finds authenticity in the past. And because classical Islamic epistemology and hermeneutics is heavily textualist-based, then it cannot go beyond the confines of its own parameters. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah. There are also a number of mechanisms.
I would like to reflect your sentence. I find it very important, very important. I think the difference between the old style of interpreting the Quran and this progressive method is so that the other tafsir, we call it, is more text-based, and the understanding of the progressive is includes the universe as well, and human beings as well, everything in it, not only the text base, and it is all included and holistic based, and life is developing in every second, and everything is changing, and our reflection will be also on that direction. Is it so?
You have summarized this really, really well. Yes, I don't need to say anything else. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't think I need to speak anymore. I've been speaking for a long time. You know, there is also in relation to the concept of sunnah, for example, how is it different from the classical approach? But it becomes very technical. So there's also, I have tried to think about the concept of sunnah itself, also because it's very important. We know that a lot of patriarchal understanding of the Islamic tradition comes from certain hadith that can be very androcentric. Some of them are misogynistic in nature. So that's why it's important to develop a concept of sunnah that does not depend entirely on the classical hadith sciences. And so basically, the kind of mechanisms that are the hermeneutics that are applied to the Quran also equally apply to the hadith as well. So at the end of the day, when we ask the question, you know, what is the relation between Islam and democracy, Islam and gender equality, Islam and feminism, Islam, there are all these. We have to do a lot of deconstruction. And then we need to make explicit what's really important for people who have the responsibility and the burden of interpreting the tradition. We need to be very transparent and explain what are our assumptions, what are our commitments, why do we interpret the way we do, and try to explain it to the non-academic people as much as it is possible, so that they can appreciate and understand why do people interpret Islam in many different ways, and to also come to the conclusion that no single interpretation is inevitable and always fully correct. that there are so many layers, something hiding underneath, and then we can deconstruct all of these assumptions and commitments. Some of them are in relation to interpretational methodology, the texts, but some of them are metatextual, yeah, and go into the realm of metaphysics or philosophy, ethics. So all of these become important. And that's why we have always had different interpretations, and we have very liberal, progressive Muslims, or very traditionalist and conservative. It's important for us to understand and respect each other's differences and opinions. And just to just to be aware of this, what I call interpretational awareness, spread interpretational awareness, and say, you know, and understand that at the end of the day, it is the kind of ethics we have as human beings, and the kind of concept of the divine is going to really, at the end of the day, that's what we are comfortable with, and the concept of the divine that we have inside our hearts. That's going to be the most decisive kind of factor when trying to adjudicate and say which interpretation. And of course, there's that famous hadith that talks about, you know, consult your heart if you want, in the context of like what to do in a certain context, in context of a fatwa, for example, you know, consult your heart and then you will know what to do. So in that sense, it is so important then to work on our spirituality, to work on our sense of ethics, sense of a moral compass, and and ask ourselves, how can we be the best possible human being we can be, so that we truly reflect the nature of the divine as the ultimate source of beauty, justice, and goodness. Thank you.